When I met Daniel, I wasn't looking for love, not really. I had just turned 30, had gone through a string of disappointing relationships, and honestly, I was tired of men who only seemed to want something from me, attention, validation, or simply a temporary distraction. But Daniel seemed different from the start. He was charming in a subtle way, attentive, and he made me feel like I was the only woman in the room whenever we were together. We met at a charity gala my friend dragged me to, a fundraiser for a children's hospital. While I wasn't particularly wealthy compared to the crowd, I suppose I looked like I belonged there, in my sleek black dress, diamonds I had inherited from my grandmother sparkling under the chandeliers, the kind of jewelry that gave people an impression about you before you even opened your mouth. Daniel approached me with a smile that looked genuine and asked if I was enjoying myself, his voice deep, calm, and steady, the kind that immediately made you lean in to listen closer. I remember he had this way of tilting his head slightly whenever he asked a question, like he was really invested in the answer. It made me feel seen, which was rare. We spent the whole evening talking, him telling me about his job in marketing, his travels, his close-knit family back in Chicago, and by the time the night was over, I gave him my number, though in the back of my mind, there was always that tiny alarm, the one that reminded me how quickly men seemed to fall for the idea of me rather than the reality. Because the truth was, yes, I had money, or rather, I had come into money recently, when my father passed away the year before. He had left me a sizable inheritance, not billions, not the kind of wealth that made headlines, but enough to make me comfortable for the rest of my life if I managed it wisely. I didn't flaunt it, I didn't talk about it, and I certainly didn't lead with it, but I knew how people looked at me when they realized I wasn't scrambling paycheck to paycheck like they were, and sometimes that look shifted everything, friendships, romances, even casual acquaintances. I wondered how Daniel would react if he knew, but for the first few months of dating, everything was almost perfect. He was attentive, affectionate, the kind of man who remembered small details, like how I took my coffee, 2 sugars and a splash of cream, or the way I always carried a notebook in my bag to jot down thoughts. He noticed the chipped corner of my favorite mug and replaced it without me asking. He took me to little hidden restaurants in parts of town I had never explored, planned hiking trips that left us breathless both from the climb and the view, and even surprised me with flowers for no reason, not roses, but daisies, because he remembered I once said they reminded me of my childhood backyard. It all felt genuine, so much so that I let myself fall deeper. But then little things began to surface, cracks in the perfect picture, like when he asked casually one night how much my condo cost, or when he seemed overly impressed by the car I drove, my father's old Mercedes, which I had kept more out of sentiment than style. I noticed how often he made comments about the future, not just our future together, but the kind that circled back to comfort, stability, and never having to worry. He made jokes about how lucky I was to have such financial security, jokes that sounded lighthearted but carried a sharp edge, as if he was testing the waters. I brushed them off at first, thinking maybe I was overanalyzing, maybe I was just paranoid because of past experiences, but the thought lingered. Still, I let myself get swept up in his world. He introduced me to his friends, who were loud and boisterous and seemed to adore him, though I couldn't shake the way they looked at me sometimes, like I was a prize he had somehow won, a trophy they didn't expect him to get. We traveled together, and he always made a point of asking me to book the hotels, letting me handle the expenses without directly acknowledging it. When I once teased him about being thrifty, he grinned and said, "Why spend my money when yours works just as well?" It was framed as a joke, but I didn't laugh. The man was clever, and I could see it. Then, the proposal came, about a year in. It was romantic, candlelight dinner at a rooftop restaurant, a ring that sparkled but wasn't extravagant, and a heartfelt speech about how he couldn't imagine his life without me. He even got down on one knee, the whole restaurant clapping when I said yes. For a while, I convinced myself I had finally found my person, the one who saw me, not the bank account attached to me. But on the night of our engagement party, I overheard something that made my blood run cold. Daniel was in the garden with his best friend, a guy named Trevor. They thought no one could hear them, but I had stepped outside for some air and froze when I heard Daniel laugh and say, "Man, I told you, she's loaded. This is my ticket out. All I have to do is play the perfect husband and I'm set." Trevor laughed with him, saying, "Smart move, bro. She's pretty too, so win-win." I remember gripping the railing so tightly my fingers hurt, my chest tightening as if all the air had been sucked out of me. I had to force myself not to burst out crying right then. Instead, I walked back inside, smile plastered on my face, pretending nothing was wrong. But inside, something shifted permanently. As much as I loved him, or thought I did, I knew at that moment Daniel didn't love me. Not really. He loved the security he thought I provided. And the worst part was, I let him believe it. Instead of calling off the wedding, instead of confronting him that night, I made a decision, one that would change everything. I decided to play along, to let him think he had fooled me, to let him believe I was his golden goose. But deep down, I was already planning how this game would end, and how I would make sure he never saw it coming. Because if Daniel wanted to build a marriage on lies and greed, then he was going to discover that he wasn't the only one capable of playing the game. The wedding went ahead as planned. The photographs showed a picture-perfect couple smiling at each other, our guests clinking glasses and cheering, but behind my smile was the knowledge of what I had overheard and the plan I had quietly begun forming. Daniel thought he had me fooled. He thought he was marrying into money, but what he didn't know was that I had already spoken to my attorney before the wedding and arranged something most people wouldn't even consider, a prenuptial agreement that was worded carefully, subtly, and legally airtight. The document stated that should the marriage ever dissolve, Daniel would leave with exactly what he came in with, no more, no less. I framed it as a simple measure to protect both of us, a way to avoid messy court battles in the future. Daniel balked at it when I first brought it up. He said, "Do you really not trust me, Anna?" His tone dripped with wounded pride, but I soothed him, explaining that it was standard procedure for anyone with an inheritance, that my lawyer insisted, and that it wasn't about him, it was about my father's legacy. Eventually, he relented, though I caught the flicker of annoyance in his eyes. It wasn't the reaction of a man who wanted to protect his wife's peace of mind. It was the reaction of a man who realized his jackpot had strings attached. But he signed because what else could he do? Walk away and confirm my suspicions? No, Daniel was too clever for that. He signed with a tight smile and said, "If this makes you feel safe, then fine, but I'll never need it," and I kissed him and pretended to believe him. Inside, though, I knew I had just clipped his wings before he could even fly. Married life with Daniel was strange. On the surface, we were the golden couple, dinners with friends, vacations to beautiful places, endless compliments from people about how perfect we seemed. But underneath, I watched him carefully, cataloging every move, every comment, every subtle way he tried to align his life with mine. He pushed me to consider buying a bigger house, saying things like, "Don't you want a fresh start together, something that's ours?" But I knew what he really meant, a house in his name too, something he could lay claim to later. I smiled sweetly and told him I loved my condo, that it held too many memories of my father to leave behind. He didn't press further, but the disappointment was written on his face. Another time, he suggested we open a joint account, saying it would make things easier. "We're a team, right?" he told me, lacing his fingers through mine as if to sweeten the suggestion. I agreed, but only for household expenses, groceries, bills, the mundane. Nothing substantial. I put in a small allowance each month, enough to cover everything, and he contributed a token amount from his salary. His smile was tight when he realized the account was a shallow pool rather than the ocean he had hoped for. He started making small remarks, casual but sharp. "You're lucky, Anna. Not everyone has the kind of cushion you do, or must be nice to not have to stress about money." I laughed them off, but deep down I knew he was reminding me, and himself too, of why he was there. Still, I let him believe I was blind. I let him think his mask was firmly in place. All the while, I was slowly preparing, testing him, pushing boundaries. I wanted to know how far his greed went, and I didn't have to wait long to find out. One night, after a dinner with his friends, Daniel came home drunk, stumbling into the living room. He flopped onto the couch and started rambling about how he was going to give me the life I deserved, but then he muttered something that made my skin crawl. He said, "Don't worry, baby. Once I get you to sell that condo, we'll really be set. Trevor thinks I should get you to invest in his company, quick cash out, we'll be golden." My heart pounded as I stood silently in the hallway, unseen, hearing him confess to plans he hadn't even shared with me sober. The mask had slipped again, and it was uglier than I imagined. I walked upstairs quietly, leaving him to snore on the couch, my mind racing. I knew then that Daniel wasn't just after comfort. He was actively scheming, strategizing, treating me like a business opportunity rather than a wife. That sealed it for me. He wasn't just selfish, he was dangerous to my future if I let him keep pulling strings. Still, I played the part of the loving wife. I kissed him in public, held his hand, told him I loved him, but inside, I was building a fortress. I began moving money quietly into accounts he didn't know about, diversifying investments so he could never track the full scope of my finances. I also started documenting everything. I kept receipts, notes, even recorded a few conversations when he slipped and said things that revealed his intentions. I didn't know when I would use them, but I knew the day would come. Our fights started becoming more frequent, though never explosive, just small arguments that lingered, like when I refused to co-sign a loan with him. He had pitched it as a business opportunity, but when I asked for details, he got vague, deflecting, saying I didn't trust him. I told him calmly, "It's not about trust, Daniel. It's about being responsible." He sulked for days after that, but I didn't budge. Another time, he pushed me about selling my father's Mercedes, telling me it was impractical and we could get 2 new cars instead. I refused, saying I loved that car, and he dropped it. But I caught the way he clenched his jaw, the frustration he tried to hide. Piece by piece, his patience was wearing thin. Piece by piece, I was peeling back the man he really was. Then came the night that confirmed everything. We were at a friend's birthday party, a lively gathering with music and too much champagne, and I excused myself to the powder room. On my way back, I passed by the study where Daniel was standing with Trevor again, their voices low but not low enough. I heard Trevor say, "So, when are you gonna get her to loosen the purse strings, man? You've been married 6 months and you're still living in that same condo." Daniel laughed and said, "Relax, it's only a matter of time. She's soft. She loves me. Once she's completely wrapped around my finger, she'll give me whatever I want. I just gotta keep playing the role of patience pays off, bro." I stood frozen, heart thudding, anger and betrayal coursing through me like wildfire. But then a cold clarity settled over me. He really believed I was that naive. That blind. And that gave me power. Because what Daniel didn't know was that I wasn't soft. I wasn't blind. I had no intention of being anyone's fool. If he wanted to play games, he was about to discover that I was far better at them than he could ever imagine. After that night at the birthday party, I started executing my plan more deliberately. Every move was calculated, every word measured. Daniel continued to flaunt what he thought was control over me. He asked me to transfer funds for his friends' investment ideas, suggested vacations and purchases he assumed I would approve because he believed I was shallow and eager to please. I smiled, nodded, and complied just enough to keep him thinking he was winning, but behind the scenes, I was creating layers of security. Every dollar he thought he had influence over was actually being redirected into accounts he could never access. I also started manipulating situations to test his true intentions. I invited him to a charity gala and asked him to drive the car he had mocked months earlier, but I made sure it was empty of valuables. Watching his expression as he looked at the car and the parking ticket he had to pay for himself was delicious. He didn't suspect I had arranged it to be a lesson, subtle but precise. At home, I began leaving small hints that I was aware, just enough to unsettle him. Casual comments dropped into conversation, I was thinking about reviewing our finances tonight, or I spoke to my lawyer about that contract. He says everything's in order. He would nod politely, trying to appear confident, but I could see the shadow cross his face, the first real sign that maybe his illusion of control was slipping. Then came the night that truly marked the turning point. Daniel came home late from a business dinner, smelling of cologne and cheap perfume. Something felt off immediately. I pretended to be asleep in the bedroom, but my ears were alert. I overheard him talking on the phone, whispering in urgent tones, "She doesn't suspect anything. I need Trevor to handle the rest. The condo sale will go through by next week, and the joint accounts need to be shifted into my name quietly." My heart raced as I listened. This was bigger than I imagined. He wasn't just greedy, he was plotting to take advantage of our marriage in ways that were illegal. I decided to act, but carefully. I didn't want confrontation yet. I wanted leverage. I began gathering proof, recording conversations, saving every email, every message. I even started setting traps online, subtly luring him to reveal more about his intentions. He didn't realize that I had created a separate email, a mirror of his accounts, where every transaction he suggested for personal gain was documented, backed up, and timestamped. The best part was, he believed I was oblivious, still thinking he had fooled me completely. I started dropping social hints, speaking to friends about how trust is everything in a marriage, casually mentioning things like I always make sure my financial advisor knows what's happening, leaving breadcrumbs he couldn't resist. He became increasingly brazen, overconfident in what he assumed was my ignorance. He began to plan larger purchases, more investments, all under the guise of family future, yet all I saw was him slowly cornering himself. He didn't know I had already simulated every possible outcome. Every potential move he made could be dismantled with the press of a button, but I wanted to wait for the perfect moment. I wanted him to believe he was winning until the very last second. One evening, he tried to persuade me to co-sign a loan for a luxury car. He said, "It's just temporary, trust me, this will pay off." I smiled sweetly, told him I needed to check with my lawyer first, and privately mocked him to myself because he genuinely thought I would cave. Then I began orchestrating situations that would make him reveal his true character to others. I invited him to a dinner with mutual friends and asked about the condo sale and investments, pretending to be naive. He casually mentioned how he had everything under control and how easy it would be to get me to agree to certain things, and one of our friends raised an eyebrow. I could see the flicker of panic in Daniel's eyes. That night, I realized my trap was working. I was luring him to overexpose himself, and he didn't even know. The more he talked, the more evidence I gathered, the more I planned. The ultimate goal wasn't just to protect my money. It was to make sure Daniel never underestimated me. The next few weeks, I introduced subtle chaos, things that destabilized him just enough to make him anxious. I left little notes in places he would see, mentioning lawyer appointments that didn't exist, legal advice that was carefully fabricated to make him second-guess every decision. Then the real game began. I suggested a luxurious getaway, one where he assumed I would pay for everything, but I subtly made it so that every booking, every activity, every expense could be traced and recorded. I wanted him to expose himself completely, to show me who he really was when he thought no one was watching. And he did. Within 2 days, he started hinting to Trevor about how he planned to access funds, and Trevor, thinking he was in on the scheme, shared every detail, not knowing I had arranged the rooms so their private phone conversations were within earshot, recorded on devices they didn't see. I watched Daniel grow confident again, blissfully unaware that his every word was being documented. Then came the evening that pushed him over the edge. I presented him with an urgent financial decision, a complex investment opportunity one pretended I had researched. He was excited, thinking it was a chance to access funds illicitly, and he plunged into the plan without hesitation, revealing in excruciating detail how he intended to siphon money, how he would manipulate paperwork, and even how he would pressure staff to facilitate the transfers. I listened, smiled, took notes in my mind, and made mental snapshots. Everything he said now would be evidence. Everything he confessed would be a nail in the coffin for his deception. By the end of the evening, I knew I had him completely. He believed he was untouchable. He believed he had me convinced that I was nothing more than a wealthy wife ripe for exploitation. And all the while, I was plotting the final steps, the reveal that would leave him shocked, humiliated, and completely powerless. I was no longer just protecting my money. I was taking back the narrative. I was transforming betrayal into strategy. Daniel had no idea that his own greed was about to be the instrument of his downfall. Daniel was more reckless than ever. His confidence, fueled by his assumption that I was still the naive, wealthy wife he had married, made him careless. I let him believe every word, every plan, every scheme was flying under my radar. I even encouraged it subtly, praising his business instincts, while meticulously documenting every conversation, every transaction, and every dishonest intention. He began involving other people, suggesting friends, co-workers, even his cousin could help manage our growing empire, never realizing that each one became a witness to his plan. I started arranging private dinners, gatherings, and outings where Daniel's arrogance would spill over. Each time, he became more vocal, more explicit, and more careless. The thrill of control he believed he had made him blind. One afternoon, I suggested we visit a potential vacation property together, a sprawling estate by the lake that he assumed I would buy simply because I could. He made a show of inspecting every detail, mentioning renovations, interior designers, and construction costs as if he were already in command of the budget. I nodded along, jotting notes and quietly recording the entire conversation. Later that evening, I called Trevor under the pretense of needing advice about the property. While he explained logistics, Daniel casually confessed his plan to manipulate me into signing over control of multiple accounts. It was a reckless admission, and I filed every detail away. My heart raced with the realization that his arrogance had finally outpaced his caution. I started dropping hints that I knew more than I let on, casual remarks about legal counsel, veiled comments about transparency, and Daniel began to show signs of unease. He tried to regain composure, attempting to mask the nervous flicker in his eyes with jokes, but I could see it, the first cracks of panic in the man who had once been so confident. Then I orchestrated a situation that would force him into an immediate confession. I suggested that we hold a financial review evening, framing it as a routine part of our married life. Daniel, thinking it was a normal check-in, arrived with casual arrogance, sipping his drink, convinced that he would continue to maneuver freely. I seated him at the dining table and presented a mock investment scenario that I pretended I had prepared for weeks, complex, confusing, and perfect for coaxing him into revealing his intentions. He leaned forward eagerly, explaining exactly how he would manipulate the accounts, shift funds, and gain access to money without raising suspicion. I smiled and nodded, recording every word with subtle devices hidden around the room. By the end of the evening, he had laid bare every scheme he had been planning since before the wedding. He didn't realize that he had just built the evidence against himself brick by brick. Over the next few days, I started planting subtle but damning evidence in places he would notice: emails, notes, even printed copies of financial statements that highlighted the very discrepancies he had suggested. I let him discover them one by one, his panic growing as he thought I had finally realized everything. He confronted me in a mixture of anger and desperation. "Anna, what are you doing? You can't prove anything." I smiled, calm, and told him, "I don't need to prove anything yet, Daniel. I just need you to be honest with me." He tried to negotiate, to charm, even to manipulate me into silence, but I refused every attempt. I let him believe he still had a chance, dangling the illusion of forgiveness like a carrot, all the while coordinating with my lawyer, preparing for the final act. I also made sure our friends and family were gently aware, planting subtle suspicions that would make him feel isolated, paranoia creeping in. Daniel's behavior shifted dramatically. He was on edge, questioning his own decisions, second-guessing every plan he had ever laid out. He thought I was unaware, that I was still playing along, but but I was orchestrating the perfect timing for the reveal. The night came when I invited him to a celebratory dinner, the pretense of normalcy masking my real intentions. The table was set beautifully, candles flickering, wine chilled, and I waited for him to settle into the comfort of assumed victory. I began casually bringing up topics related to finances, the condo, the joint accounts, each remark designed to make him squirm. His hands twitched, his voice faltered, and he leaned closer, whispering apologies and explanations he thought were private. I smiled and said nothing, letting his words hang in the air like evidence. Then, when the timing was perfect, I revealed the first layer of my plan. I produced a small envelope and handed it to him. Inside were copies of every conversation, every email, every recorded admission he had made over the months. His eyes widened, panic flashing across his face. He stammered, tried to explain, to deny, but I stopped him calmly, telling him, "Daniel, you married me for my money, and you thought I was blind. You believed you could manipulate me, deceive me, and profit from me, but I let you play the part of the winning husband. Now, you see, the game is over." He sank back into his chair, defeated, the arrogance that had once defined him replaced by horror. I continued, explaining how the prenuptial agreement, the hidden accounts, and the documented evidence had all been designed to protect me and ensure that if he tried to access funds unlawfully, he would have no recourse. His lips parted, no words forming, realization and regret finally settling in. The man who thought he had mastered manipulation had been outplayed at every turn. I had maintained the illusion, nurtured the trap, and now I controlled the narrative. I gave him a choice: walk away quietly and preserve some dignity, or risk exposure to everyone. Daniel swallowed hard, nodding, understanding that his own greed had led him here. In that moment, I felt no triumph in cruelty, only the satisfaction of justice, knowing the man who had underestimated me had learned that he was not smarter, more cunning, or more powerful than the woman he tried to exploit. After the confrontation, Daniel was a different man. The arrogance that had fueled his schemes was replaced by quiet desperation. He tried to apologize, to explain, but I made it clear that while I had no desire for revenge, I would not tolerate deceit or manipulation. The prenuptial agreement ensured he had nothing to gain from me beyond what was fair, and the evidence I had collected was ready to be shared if necessary. I didn't need to humiliate him publicly, the private knowledge of his defeat was enough. Yet I couldn't resist using the power strategically. I began to subtly reshape our social life, making sure friends and family understood that I was fully aware of Daniel's character, not in a vindictive way, but to prevent any future misjudgments. Daniel complied outwardly, realizing that any attempt to regain control would be futile. Over the next few months, I watched him adapt to a new reality, a reality where I called the shots and he followed. He began attending charity events and dinners with me, but he was no longer the man who assumed dominance. He became quieter, more cautious, and occasionally I caught him glancing at me with a mix of admiration and fear. The tables had turned completely. I continued to manage our finances, our home, and even his career advice, subtly steering him away from any schemes he might consider. He became almost like a partner in name only, a man who thought he had married for wealth but instead found himself married to a woman who would not be underestimated. And in the midst of all this, I discovered something unexpected: the thrill of control, the satisfaction of outmaneuvering someone who had believed they were cleverer than me. It wasn't about money anymore, it was about respect, and the realization that I had achieved both in a way that was clean, intelligent, and precise. There were moments when I almost felt sympathy for Daniel, a man whose own greed had trapped him in a cage of his own making, but those moments were fleeting, replaced quickly by the awareness that I had protected myself while also teaching a lesson he would never forget. Then, one evening, Daniel approached me quietly, hesitant, almost vulnerable. He said, "Anna, I understand now. I see what I did, and I want to make things right. I want to be better if you'll let me." I studied him, seeing the sincerity, or at least the desperation, in his eyes. I realized that I could have punished him further, exposed him publicly, or ended the marriage entirely, but instead I chose a different path. I said, Daniel, you have a choice. You can be honest from now on, contribute in good faith, and perhaps earn back some trust, or you can walk away and live with what you've done. He nodded, swallowed hard, and for the first time in our marriage I felt a sense of equilibrium, a fragile balance where neither of us had to play games anymore. Daniel adapted. He learned to respect boundaries, to consult rather than manipulate, and over time I allowed small glimpses of the man I had once loved to shine through. We traveled, we laughed, and while the dynamic of our relationship had shifted permanently, I found a certain freedom in knowing that I was in control, not because I had wealth, but because I had strategy, foresight, and patience. The money had been the catalyst, not the reward. Daniel's schemes had inadvertently taught me how strong I could be, how clever I could play the long game, and how to ensure that my life could never be derailed by someone else's greed. Months passed, and eventually I realized I had grown fond of the new Daniel, a man who had learned humility, who understood the consequences of deceit, and who now truly appreciated me, not as a bank account, but as a partner. The journey had been painful, thrilling, and transformative. I had played a dangerous game, letting him believe he had the upper hand, only to flip the script completely. In doing so, I discovered not only how to protect myself, but how to take control of my destiny. Daniel never forgot that night when the truth was revealed, nor did he forget the months of subtle dominance I had exerted while he believed he was winning. Our marriage survived, yes, but the dynamic had changed forever, and I had emerged not just protected, but victorious in a way that no money could buy. He had married me for my money, he had believed he had one, and I had let him think that, only to prove that the most valuable thing I possessed was never my inheritance, but my mind, my patience, and my ability to turn betrayal into triumph. He learned the hard way that underestimating me was the biggest mistake of his life, and I had the satisfaction of knowing that I had done it elegantly, silently, and without ever compromising my own integrity.